Sometime in the final years of the 1890s, a Chumash elder told a rancher near Point Conception something specific enough that he wrote it down without fully understanding what he was recording. She described a village, not a spirit world, not a place where the dead go. Ground that people had walked on, fished from, built on and buried their dead in, now lying beneath the channel that separates the California mainland from the islands. And she described one detail that stopped him completely, that on certain calm mornings when the water was clear, people could still see shapes on the channel floor near the old crossing point that did not look like natural rock formations. That detail is either the most specific piece of geographic memory in the entire oral record of the California coast, or it is the most precisely accurate description of a drowned settlement ever recorded in a private notebook by an untrained observer who had no idea what he was writing down. Subscribe now, because what the sonar found on that channel floor in the last decade does not make this account easier to dismiss. She did not describe a mythological event. She described physical erosion, the ground giving way not suddenly, not in a single catastrophic flood, but across seasons and years the way a riverbank erodes, gradually, incrementally, the way something witnessed across a lifetime gets described rather than something compressed into a single dramatic image. She described fresh water nearby, good fishing, canoes launching regularly from the settlement toward the island crossing, a burial ground with specific location, the features of a functioning coastal community with operational detail, not a symbolic paradise existing outside of time. The rancher wrote it into notebooks that were never submitted anywhere, kept within his own family, treated as personal curiosity rather than testimony belonging in an institutional archive. A grandson showed portions to a small regional historical society in the 1970s. A handful of pages were transcribed into a mimeographed local newsletter with a print run so small almost no copies survived in any public collection. No professional archaeologist followed up, not because the account was examined and found wanting, because a family newsletter transcription from an untrained 19th century rancher did not register as a document worth cross-checking against a body of Smithsonian field notes sitting largely unread in Washington. The clearest surviving parallel to what she described was recorded a generation later by the linguist John Peabody Harrington, working with a Chumash consultant named Fernando Librado, fieldwork running from around 1912 into the 1920s, producing one of the most detailed surviving records of Chumash cosmology anywhere in the historical archive. According to the origin account Librado gave Harrington, the Earth Mother Hutash created the first people on the island of Limu, the Chumash name for what is now Santa Cruz Island. When the island grew too crowded, she built a bridge across the channel to the mainland made from a rainbow. The people crossed in the dark and Hutash warned them not to look down. Those who looked fell into the churning water below, and Hutash transformed them into dolphins as they fell, so they would not drown. That is why the Chumash consider dolphins their relatives. Anthropologists classified this as a creation myth, filed it alongside comparable origin narratives from cultures around the world, treated its geographical detail as symbolic rather than literal. A rainbow bridge across open ocean is not a plausible physical structure, so the story went into the folklore category and stayed there. That classification was not a finding based on testing the claim against physical evidence. Nobody tested it, because nobody thought there was anything to test. To understand why this testimony deserves to be treated as geographic record rather than dismissed as folklore, you have to understand what kind of people the Chumash actually were. Not a foraging population living at the margins, one of the densest and most sophisticated maritime civilizations in pre-contact North America. Population estimates before Spanish contact range between 15,000 and 22,000 people across dozens of permanent villages. some of them larger than any European settlement on the continent at the time. They built plank canoes called tommels, sewn from redwood planks corked with natural asphalt that seeped up from underwater seeps in the Santa Barbara Channel itself. A tommel could carry a crew and cargo across open water to the islands in a single day in conditions that would capsize a rowboat. Shell bead currency, ground and drilled by specialists on the islands, functioned across the entire region, with exchange rates precise enough that later archaeologists reconstructed them from bead counts in burial sites. This was not a simple society passing stories around a fire. This was a sophisticated maritime trading civilization that had been operating in this specific channel for thousands of years, and knew this water better than any European institution that later came to classify its oral tradition as myth. Then came the missions. Within a single human lifetime, the Chumash population collapsed by approximately 90%, driven by introduced disease, forced relocation, and the systematic destruction of the village and marriage networks that had sustained their society for centuries. In 1824, Chumash neophytes at 3 missions rose up in a coordinated revolt, seizing Mission La Purissima outright and holding it for close to a month before Mexican troops retook it by force. The families who fled into the interior afterward, rather than return to mission control, were the same lineages who carried forward the geographical and cosmological knowledge that later ethnographers would spend decades trying to recover second-hand. What the missions did not erase the revolt's aftermath scattered into the mountains, out of reach of the institutions that eventually came looking for it. Librado himself died in 1915 in the middle of his work with Harrington, before it was fully transcribed. Harrington was famously reluctant to publish. His Chumash notes remained inaccessible to other researchers for decades after his death in 1961, sitting in boxes at the Smithsonian rather than in print, where a geologist studying the Channel Islands might have come across them. The single most detailed surviving record of the Limu crossing story sat in those boxes for most of the 20th century, while the geological evidence that would eventually confirm its underlying physical claim was accumulating in a completely separate discipline that had no reason to open them. 2 bodies of knowledge developing simultaneously, the oral tradition in a family notebook and a linguist's boxes at the Smithsonian. The geology in sea level reconstruction papers and coastal sediment cores, no mechanism connecting them, no institution whose mandate was to put them in the same room. And the elder's account from the 1890s sitting in a newsletter with almost no surviving copies, while the science that would eventually confirm what she described was being built by researchers who had never heard of her or the rancher who wrote down what she said. The convergence that makes this investigation impossible to dismiss happened entirely by accident, and it is still happening right now. Here is what nobody in the 1890s had any way of knowing. The Channel the Elder described a village sinking beneath the stretch of water between Point Conception and the Channel Islands was not always a channel. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea level stood approximately 390 feet lower than it does today. 390 feet. Because so much of the planet's water was locked into continental ice sheets that the ocean itself had retreated far below its current shoreline across every coast on Earth simultaneously. At that sea level, the 4 northern Channel Islands, San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa, were not 4 separate islands, they were one. A single landmass geologists now call Santa Rosae, roughly twice the size of the largest island that exists today, sitting separated from the California mainland not by 20 miles of open ocean but by a crossing closer to 4 or 5 miles across. 4 or 5 miles on a clear day with the mainland visible the entire way. The Rainbow Bridge in the Hutash story is not describing a literal structure of light-spanning open ocean. It is describing, in the only language available to a culture without written geology, a moment when the distance between Limu and the mainland was crossable in a way it no longer is, And on that specific point, the geological record does not qualify the story or contextualize it or treat it with academic caution. It confirms it. Now the drowning, because this is where the oral tradition stops being vague and starts being precise in ways that no fabricated story would be. As the ice sheets melted, sea level rose across the following millennia, not smoothly, not gradually, not at a rate that a human lifetime could register as anything but stability punctuated by occasional flooding. Geologists have identified at least one period of catastrophic acceleration. Meltwater pulse 1a, roughly 14,600 years ago, when the collapse of unstable ice sheet sections pushed global sea level up by as much as 50 feet. In a span some researchers estimate at under 500 years, 50 feet in 5 centuries. A shoreline that had been stable within living memory could move inland by a noticeable distance within a single elder's lifetime during an event like that. A coastal settlement built at what had been a reliable distance from the water would find itself threatened not across geological time but across human time, across the time it takes to watch a child grow to adulthood, across the time it takes for a story about a crossing that used to be shorter to become worth preserving. The elder described the ground giving way across seasons and years. That is exactly what Meltwater Pulse 1a would have looked like from the shore. The physical evidence for how early people were actually living in this region during that drowning event is not theoretical. In 1959, human remains were excavated on Santa Rosa Island at a site called Arlington Springs. Later, redated using improved radiocarbon methods, those remains came back at approximately 13,000 years old, among the oldest confirmed human remains found anywhere in the Americas. 13,000 years ago, Santa Rosa still existed as the western edge of Santa Rosae, separated from the mainland by that narrower crossing, and someone made that crossing by boat, not on foot across a land bridge, by boat across open Pacific Ocean, at a level of maritime sophistication that surprised the archaeologists who found the evidence because it pushed boat technology in the Americas back further than the accepted timeline had accounted for. A maritime people crossing open Pacific water 13,000 years ago is not a myth. It is a confirmed archaeological fact sitting in the peer-reviewed record. And the Chumash oral tradition describing that crossing, the bridge, the channel, the people who fell, was sitting in Harrington's boxes at the Smithsonian while those bones were being excavated on the island. The two lines of evidence never met because they were in completely separate institutional categories, not because either of them was wrong. Now, the implication that makes the entire established model of early American settlement uncomfortable. The Kelp Highway hypothesis, compifis, developed most prominently by archaeologist John Erlandson and his colleagues, proposes that the earliest migration into the Americas moved primarily along the coast by boat following a nearly continuous belt of kelp forest ecosystems running from northeast Asia down the Pacific Rim. Kelp forests are extraordinarily productive. Rich in fish, shellfish, marine mammals, a maritime people moving along the belt would have had a reliable food source at every stage of the journey without needing to wait for an interior ice corridor to open. If the Kelp Highway hypothesis is correct, and the physical evidence at Arlington Springs increasingly supports it, then the Santa Barbara Channel was not a peripheral outpost of early American settlement. It sat at the center of the earliest coastal migration route on the entire Pacific coast of North America. And here is the problem that creates a coastal migration route follows the coastline. The coastline of 13,000 years ago is not the coastline that exists today. Sea level rise has submerged an enormous section of the continental shelf along the California coast, extending the drowned zone many miles out from the current shoreline. In places, whatever settlements, camps and crossing points existed along that ancient coast are now sitting underwater, buried under sediment on a stretch of continental shelf that has never been systematically surveyed by archaeologists working at the depths required. the most important archaeological corridor in the early peopling of the Americas, is sitting under between 200 and 400 feet of Pacific Ocean. And nobody mapped it before it went under, because the people who knew it as dry land didn't have writing. They had oral tradition. In 2016, researchers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed published a study examining Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describing coastlines and islands in configurations that no longer exist, matching with striking precision the coastline of Australia as it stood before post-glacial sea level rise more than 7,000 years ago. Their conclusion, that certain oral traditions can preserve accurate geographical memory across spans of time most historians assumed were beyond the reach of purely verbal transmission, was controversial when first proposed. It is increasingly accepted. If an oral tradition on one continent can preserve accurate coastal geography across 7,000 years of submersion, there is no principled reason to assume a comparable tradition on the California coast could not do the same. The dismissal of the Chumash accounts as symbolic was a disciplinary habit, not a finding. The University of California established its anthropology department in 1901 under Alfred Kroeber, whose California survey work treated origin narratives primarily as cultural and linguistic data rather than as potential evidence of geological events. A story about a rainbow bridge went into the same analytical category as a story about a trickster coyote. Neither was read as a record a geologist might need to consult. That category system held for most of the 20th century, and the geology spent that same century quietly confirming everything that oral tradition had been saying. The elder described a village sinking gradually beneath the channel near the old crossing point. The geology confirms the crossing was once shorter. The geology confirms coastal land went underwater across exactly the timescales she described, not in a single flood, but across seasons and years of incremental loss. The geology confirms someone was making that crossing 13,000 years ago with sufficient maritime technology to reach an island in open ocean. And the geology confirms that whatever those people left along the ancient coastline is now sitting on a submerged continental shelf that the sonar is only now beginning to reach. The oral tradition was not describing a myth. It was describing a physical process it had watched happen, and the science has spent a century catching up to what a Chumash elder described to a rancher in the 1890s in a notebook that almost nobody read. What happens next is where oral history transitions from a fascinating regional anomaly into a profound shift in how we study the deep human past. Because if an elder's notebook description from the 1890s can point directly to a submerged landscape that modern marine geology took another century to map, it forces a radical question. What else is hiding just beneath the surface of our collective assumptions? For generations, institutional science built its timelines on what could be seen with dry eyes on dry land. It categorized indigenous oral traditions as poetry, as metaphor, as anything except empirical data. Yet every time marine archaeologists point modern high-resolution sonar systems and sub-bottom profilers at the outer edges of our continental shelves, they find the exact geographies that mainstream academia spent decades writing off as folklore. The channel floor near Point Conception is no longer just a stretch of water separating the mainland from the islands. It is a physical archive. It holds the footprint of a sophisticated maritime culture that watched its world slowly reshape under the weight of a melting planet, and encoded that environmental trauma into stories precise enough to outlast empires. When we talk about the history of North America, we usually start with the written records left by explorers who arrived a few centuries ago. But the real history, the deep resilient history of human survival, adaptation and geographic memory, goes down much deeper than that. It goes down 400 feet, right down to the silent floor of the Pacific, where the ancestral landscape of Santa Rosa still rests, preserved in sediment, stone and story. The next time you look out across the Santa Barbara Channel, remember what is lying quietly just beneath the waves.